Hi, everyone. Hopefully everybody's still got some energy. Before I start, I just want to thank Liz and Rachel and everybody involved in bringing me into this context to present some of my work in relation to the exhibition and working with archives and specifically in the region of the Middle East. It's a exciting and intimidating invitation, but I'm really honored and feel like it's even been an opportunity for me to sort of reflect on my work and in a more sort of academic context to understand sort of the scope of what I'm doing. And so I hope that this will be interesting for you. For the past decade, my work as a visual artist and filmmaker has engaged with representation in sites of conflict and colonized landscapes in the region of the Middle East. Looking to media and national archives, I weave original material alongside found documents, images, and footage. The work is a mix of single-channel video, feature-length cinematic work, and installation that combines photography, moving image, text, and illustration. And as a person of Palestinian heritage, raised between Europe, the US, and the Middle East, I attempt to reflect this nomadism through a perspective that is deterritorialized. My work does not speak on behalf of anyone, nor does it address one particular audience. The aim is to challenge the way we understand history, ourselves, and conflicts close and far removed from us based on our relationship to representation. I'm going to begin with an older example of a work so that you get a sense of what my work sort of looks like that relies on a more contemporary archive, so images that were made while I'm alive, to give you an idea of what that work looks like before delving into how I've engaged with older archives in more recent pieces. We're going to watch just a 9-minute excerpt that's sort of halfway into a 20-minute video piece titled We Began by Measuring Distance.
قسنا المسافة من روما لجنيف طلعت 695 كيلو متر. قسنا المسافة من جنيف لمدريد طلعت 1024 كيلو متر. قسنا المسافة من مدريد لأوسلو طلعت 2391 كيلو متر. قسنا المسافة من أوسلو لشرم الشيخ طلعت 3988 كيلو متر. قسنا المسافة من شرم الشيخ لغزة طلعت 405 كيلو متر. قسنا المسافة من غزة للقدس طلعت 78 كيلو متر. قسنا المسافة من غزة للقدس عملت 78 كيلو متر. قسنا المسافة من غزة للقدس قطعت 78 كيلو متر. قسنا المسافة من غزة للقدس قطعت 78 كيلو متر. لا مش كده. قسنا المسافة من غزة للقدس طلعت 67. قسنا المسافة من غزة للقدس طلعت 48. قسنا المسافة من غزة للقدس طلعت 17. بما اننا لقينا نفسنا صفر اليدين قسنا المسافة من فلسطين لإسرائيل لقينا ان روما ما اتبنتش في يوم. المسافات ما سابتلناش غير الشجن، فاخترنا نروح للمكان الرحب اللي شفناه في الكتب، المكان اللي هنلاقي فيه راحة البال وصفاء القلوب. قد تبدو الصفات العامة للغابات البكر واضحة لمن يلاحظها، حتى وإن كان ذو خلفية متواضعة في التاريخ الطبيعي. وتختلف الأشجار بألوانها في الأنواع والأحجام، وقد تشكل الأغصان المتشابكة نسيجا ينتج عنه ترشيح الضوء بشكل واضح، لا سيما وقد تزيد من حدة الظل تلك السهام الضوئية التي تتخلل الأغصان المتشابكة خلال يوم مشمس. كما أن هناك قصة خفية في الاعتدال والتنوع في التوزيع والوفرة، الشجيرات والأعشاب ومختلف الشتلات. فنجد أن الكثير من ألواح الشجر الكبيرة جدا عادة وفي عدة مراحل من التدهور، والتي تفترش أرضية الغابات، قد تكون طرق طبيعية لبعض الكائنات في الحياة البرية، كما قد تعرقل البعض الآخر. فتقف الأشجار الكبيرة العتيقة الميتة، وقد تبدو للزائر المتأمل في الأرض تلك الأشجار الميتة، وخصوصا وهي في مراحلها المبكرة من التدهور والاندثار، كأنها أشجار خضراء غضة بمحض الخطأ. فهناك نجد فقط الصمت، ونسمع أو نرى القليل من العصافير والثدييات. ابتدى يجيلنا شعور واضح بإننا انضحك علينا، إن إحنا مع الأسف مرتحناش ولا ثانية، وإن المسافات هي اللي خلتنا صفر اليدين.
This piece was completed in 2009 and combines original material I had shot in Chicago, on the lake and at the aquarium, for example, along with footage from a media company I was working for in Cairo in 2008. The agency, named Ramadan, began as a grassroots organization that had the largest archive of contemporary video footage from the occupied Palestinian territories. Ramadan grew to be a powerful independent news-gathering agency, sending their crews to the site of events as they happened, boasting that they were often arriving before ambulances. I wanted to question the value of recorded history in the present. I was experimenting with the way that facts could become abstract, numbers a stand-in for events, cities, iconic symbols, and what this all amounts to. Perhaps most important for me, I wanted to explore how far-removed viewers see this material, and, as important, how it affects the way the subjects being recorded see themselves. At the core of the work is the exploitation of suffering by both the photographers and the subjects who, living in a besieged territory with little to no access to the outside world, feel a desperate attempt and need to be heard, to be believed. But to what ends? A woman pauses in the middle of her suffering to perform her agony for the camera, as deeply as it is actually felt. She still performs it. And later on, after this scene, asks, "For who are you shooting us?" It was with this work that I became obsessed with the function and the value of archives. I saw that having war televised via live feed did exactly nothing in terms of preventing unnecessary violence in the moment or in subsequent conflict. If anything, I believe those images made those who saw them more apathetic and reinforced a sense of victimhood for those recorded. Susan Sontag has a lot to say on this in her text regarding the pain of others, and I fully agree with her notion of the impotence that falls upon the spectator who believe themselves to be disconnected from on-screen real violence because of the emotions that are stirred by watching such images. I'll switch gears now to talk about a more recent work. What you're looking at is the installation view of a work titled Trompe-l'œil, which I completed in 2017. It consists of 2 mural-sized photographs hung on a corner wall, 38 images, and a mise-en-scène of furnitures, ideally the same furniture found in the 2 mural-sized photographs. As you see, it's a bad angle, but you'll see another image in a little bit. Which are printed on canvas, plus a looping video that would be played on the television screen that you see the back of. I'd like to walk you through this piece. We'll start by watching the video loop that would have been viewed on the screen as part of the installation. The loop plays as a loop. The one viewing of it is 8 minutes long, so I think I'll play the whole thing. I'll stop it there. Trompe-l'œil was a premise for reproducing, without permission, copyrighted photographs from the T.E. Lawrence collection belonging to the Imperial War Museum archives. If you bear with me, I'd like to talk a little bit about T.E. Lawrence and who he was. Thomas Edward Lawrence was born to unwed parents, rare at the time. T.E.'s father had fallen in love with his children's nanny. Running away from Ireland to England, the couple eloped when T.E.'s mother became pregnant. They gave themselves the surname Lawrence to cover up their true identities, had more children, T.E. being the second, I think, of 4 boys. There's a lot to read about Thomas Edward, whose real name was Ned, his childhood, that his mother beat him, that he was in fact 5 foot 5 inches tall, or barely that, not the 6 foot 2 inch Peter O'Toole of the 1962 film Lawrence of Arabia. We know that he was enchanted by the exotic lands of the Middle East, that he spent time in Syria and Palestine, that he learned to speak fluent Arabic and was eventually recruited to become a spy for the Arab Bureau in Cairo. We know that supposedly because of the Arab tribes' trust in Lawrence in their revolt against the Turks, they were tricked into believing that the British would support an Arab state after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. We know that this is, of course, not what the Sykes-Picot Treaty had in mind, and so T.E. was really just a traitor. And yet, as a well-rounded figure of history, we also know of his deep remorse and of his guilt. There's so much written on T.E. Lawrence. I want to quote the Smithsonian magazine on him. Today, T.E. Lawrence remains one of the most iconic figures of the early 20th century. His life has been the subject of at least 3 movies, including one considered a masterpiece. There are over 70 biographies, several plays, and innumerable articles, monographs, and dissertations. His wartime memoir, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, translated into more than a dozen languages, remains in print nearly a full century after its first publication. Part of the enduring fascination has to do with the sheer improbability of Lawrence's tale of an unassuming young Briton who found himself the champion of a downtrodden people, thrust into events that changed the course of history. Added to this is the poignancy of his journey, so masterfully rendered in David Lean's 1962 film, Lawrence of Arabia, of a man trapped by divided loyalties, torn between serving the empire whose uniform he wore and being true to those fighting and dying alongside him. It is this struggle that raises the Lawrence saga to the level of Shakespearean tragedy, as it ultimately ended badly for all concerned, for Lawrence, for the Arabs, for Britain, in the slow uncoiling of history, for the Western world at large. Loosely cloaked about the figure of T.E. Lawrence, there lingers the wistful specter of what might have been if only he had been listened to. It seems clear that Scott Anderson, who I've just been quoting from in the Smithsonian magazine, doesn't think that Arabs have any agency whatsoever. And I don't know which is more troubling, that the legacy of the Arab revolt belongs to T.E. Lawrence, or that the more nuanced and complicated story is buried by the Lawrence of Arabia version of it. The colonization of the Arab world would leave a succession of puppet dictators in the region, with much bemoaning by Arabs that contemporary tensions can be traced back to imperialist history. I've often wondered if, in the fractured tribal region that the Occident assigns the blanket term Middle East, has been robbed of agency not solely because of power-hungry Arab leaders or solely by the colonial projects of Britain or France, but if it has anything to do with the fact that the dominant perspective we have on the history of the region is still written, photographed, and presented by the Occident. Again, how does that affect agency, or how we, if I can call myself an Arab, see ourselves, if we are more valued for what others are fascinated by in us? The French-Algerian artist, Kader Atia, claims that young artists in Algeria have only the reference of Western Europe's gaze through which to understand making paintings in Algeria today. He claims, and I quote, "If you go to art schools in Algiers or Morocco now, students continue to paint images that conform to Orientalist stereotypes." I believe this is true for a lot of the region, not just North Africa. So I began to wonder about the legacy of Lawrence of Arabia today. I found that the Imperial War Museum archives contain a collection of images under the title The T.E. Lawrence Collection, dating 1888 to 1935. This is taken from the Imperial War Museum website. The museum that houses the archive was, according to their website, founded in the midst of the First World War with a mission to preserve and tell the stories of all kinds of people, not only from Britain, but from the countries of its empire. And we continue to do this work right up to present-day conflict, covering 100 years of experience through the Commonwealth. I dug around in the archives. There are several photographs with object titles as such. The disturbances between the Arab and Jewish communities in Palestine in 1936, as recorded by British Mounted Constable K.W. Rayner, Palestine Police, under the interwar content period. The photos are, a lot of these photos, labeled not available online, but contain various descriptions. I just picked 3. Scenes at an Arab funeral for casualties of the disturbances in 1936. Refugees whose property had been destroyed, evacuating the old city of Jerusalem. Destruction to property in Jaffa during the Arab revolt in 1936. In searching for archives with photographic filmic material from this period between the 2 wars, because of the decisiveness of the events during that period that would have a lasting effect on the region, I haven't found much in terms of national or simply public archives with material produced by Arabs, owned by Arabs, or distributed by Arabs, apart from the Arab Image Foundation in Beirut. In the T.E. Lawrence collection, I found 3 images, only one of which credits Lawrence as the photographer. These 3 images are of Arab slaves. So Arabs enslaving other Arabs. Of these 3 images, only one is copyright-free, the one that's by T.E. Lawrence. So I'll go back to my work, Trompe-l'œil. These were the 2 images hung in the corner of the installation. In this image, a Spanish colonial-style house in Los Angeles, I hung 3 images, which I reproduced without permission, in the living room of this house. There is a Tiffany lamp, perhaps an imitation, 3 embroidered cushions of vague Middle Eastern pattern, an Indian rug, a peace lily plant, a daybed dating from 1917. And in the arched doorway of the house is a vinyl photograph of a red curtain. In the opposite image, a large window looks onto a vinyl photograph of Matera, Italy, where Pier Paolo Pasolini filmed the Gospel according to St. Matthew, because he felt that the modern conflict and inhabitants of Palestine, Israel, had nothing to do with biblical Palestine, and decided that southern Italy looked more like what he had in mind. On another wall, as part of the installation space, I selected 38 images from the British Library Archives online collection. Unintentional music. The British Library, being the National Library of the United Kingdom, is the largest library in the world by number of items cataloged. I took a selection of images from the digital archive and removed the descriptive information from them. Because of their sheer prevalence, their number, because they were collected, stored, or restored by an imperialist country, because it was those who were able to travel and explore and take cameras around Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and all sorts of other quote-unquote uncharted territory, this collection presents itself as part of some shared collective memory and experience for us all, and continues the colonial project. These images are not my images. They're images that the British Empire made, and what it says above anything is who gets to narrate history. That's why in this work, in this opaque installation filled with images, without explanation, set in a home that is being suffocated by domesticity, in which nothing makes sense, though everything seems to be functioning, the loop begins and ends with ubiquitous hold music, which we didn't see, but basically it loops back to the record player, which then plays this kind of very familiar hold music that you would get when you call a hospital or your internet company or so on. I hoped through this work to confuse, to frustrate, and make clear that despite that I have advertised the fact that I have stolen these images from T.E. Lawrence or from the Imperial War Museum archives, my agency is impotent. White men, long dead, still control how we see the Orient. Their images are protected, restored, housed in internationally renowned museums, collected, made valuable, and then studied, engaged with, and are still and are still allowed a supposedly neutral reading of their form and their technique. I'll switch gears to another work to end this presentation. A work titled A Philistine that I completed last year. It's an installation work centered around an original text that I wrote in English that was translated to vernacular Arabic, based on a fictional train journey from Lebanon through Palestine, ending in Egypt. Divided into 3 sections based on each country, each reflects a different time period and genre as follows. So, I cover Lebanon, Palestine, and Egypt. In Lebanon, the style that the text was written in was history, and it's set in 2018. In Palestine, the style was written as a fantasy, and it's set in 1935. And in Egypt, I used erotica, and it's set in late dynasty Egypt, roughly 1150 BCE. The book was printed in limited edition and was meant to be read only in the space of the exhibition, in a room just really designed as an Ottoman-era sitting room, which is the image that you see here as part of an exhibition at CCA in Glasgow. Integral to the installation are 2 series of images, 10 originals and 14 taken from the Library of Congress. So the originals are in the middle, these larger color prints, and the black and white that you'll see actually a close-up of are taken from the Library of Congress. I think. Oops. The ones taken from the Library of Congress were reprinted as a mirroring series of 7 black and white positive prints and 7 negative prints, altered to include a black hole in the image, mimicking a practice used by Roy Stryker, who headed the Farm Security Administration program that sent photographers out to document the effects of the Great Depression in the United States. Stryker would punch a hole through the negative images he deemed unworthy quality, preventing them from ever being reproduced. I had heard that this practice was also sometimes used to limit the number of copies that would be made of a negative before the age of digital reproduction in order to preserve the value of the images. The images I selected are from the American Colony collection in Jerusalem and include photographs from the surrounding region. The original photographs, which you're now looking at, were taken on a train journey through the former Yugoslavia by land from Serbia to Croatia and Bosnia, as a way to connect the politics in the book to another site whose border conflict still resonates in the fractured geography of that territory. Rather than take original images in the Middle East, I opted to connect the narrative locations to a recent conflict in another site. Hope you can see that. The text that I wrote, titled A Philistine, was an experiment. It is flawed, layered, quotes from various sources, is written in third person, and focuses on the visceral, bodily experience of foreign spaces that we alternatively belong to and are rejected from. Rather than to write it in chapters, I omitted page numbers and divided the book into sonic movements, reflecting the events in each section. Through it, I was trying to imagine what the region would have looked like at various periods of history, attempting to clear my mind of the Orientalist depictions of the region that persist today. Even in Lebanon, in the present, a country I had spent 2 years living in, I was trying to undo the notion of it being, quote unquote, the Paris or Switzerland of the Middle East, a common expression used to refer to Lebanon's attractiveness. I focused on the misogyny, the poverty, the human trafficking, and intrusiveness that decades of factional conflict have created in the country. As the journey travels back into periods I couldn't have experienced and sites I have been forbidden from visiting, like Palestine, I turn to fantasy. And finally, in a country that has garnered centuries-long obsessions, I opted for depicting the country, the history, through erotic writing. Nearly erased by prudish archaeologists and historians, the sexual history of ancient Egypt has nearly been wiped clean. And today in Egypt, the subject of sex is taboo at best, with little to no books venturing to write erotically in the Arabic language. Hence, the book's translation to vernacular Arabic versus modern standard Arabic, which is classical and often doesn't have much descriptive language in the Arabic language, for erotic language, rather. So rather than describe landscapes, I decided to describe bodies. And to end, I'm going to read an excerpt from the text. I think it's pretty vanilla, but to be fair, there is some sex in here. So the text is following a character named Loza, who is of vague Middle Eastern origin and the reason for the journey is that she's come back to bury an estranged father who was assassinated on a case of mistaken identity. And so she begins her journey in Lebanon and ends up in ancient Egypt. So we're here, we find her here shortly after she's arrived. Her eyes traced the line where the water met the edge of the land and knew that it was low. They all watched as the fish swimming alongside their boat swallowed their young and spat them back out sporadically with short, involuntary contractions. Before their boat swung up and wound back down into Al-Uqsor, the women she had been traveling with led Loza into a cabin where they undressed each other until fully naked and helped Loza do the same. Massaging a sticky substance between their thumbs and forefingers, they began to wax each other carefully, with quick, brisk motions across the entirety of their skin. Every hair was removed, on toes, over lips, arms, the back of knees, and for some, even eyebrows. Loza watched and waxed, feeling the sweat rise inside of the cabin of their bodies. The mix of pain and pleasure had flushed everyone's cheeks. Loza sensed herself becoming slippery between the thighs, but felt paralyzed from patting the moisture from her sex in front of the others, allowing instead for this juice to mix with the honey trace that now dripped along the insides of her thighs. She found herself bent at 90 degrees, diligently going over the hairs on the delicate underneath of a woman's bottom, making sure to extract the last remaining strands from the fragile skin, while another woman ran her slender fingers across Loza's long, protruding shin. Their boat jolted back and forth as it docked firmly onto shore. The women gently bumped into one another as they lost balance, reminding Loza for an instant of an overstuffed Paris metro. Now, as her thighs rubbed together over her unusually engorged sex that pulsated at having any pressure exerted upon it, she felt delighted. Her insides convulsed in a feeding motion that continued its vibration in the pit of her stomach. She felt weak, drowned in an urgent desire to touch and be touched. She relaxed her body against the long fingers that had run across her shins to now wrap their equally long limbs across Loza's abdomen, and ever so gently caressed the excreting liquid that continued to glaze the lips between her thighs. Other hands wrapped translucent, soft textiles around her body in clothing meant to reveal the corporeal object that no longer belonged solely to Loza, but was carefully being prepared for sharing. She half closed her eyes to the smells of incense and jasmine filling the cabin. She felt herself being painted in color and smell. A wig had been fixed on top of her head, and as the women slowly filed out of the cabin and onto the fading sun, the men appeared as a mirror image. They too were hairless, wore makeup and wigs. They moved diligently on and off of the boat, loading bread and beer and lentils onto an expansive spread along a narrow table that seemed to go on forever. They drank wine as sweet as the honey they had waxed their bodies with, and their numbers grew till Loza could no longer recognize anyone around her, nor distinguish the men from the women. She found poultry and meat and was welcome to feast with a group of strangers. When Loza had grown properly full and tipsy with drink, she laid her body down on a soft bed of lush grass. Around her, they continued to unload the cargo boats that had traveled from Menf. She watched them distractedly and listened to a group huddled together behind her as they read from a poem. She heard intonations rather than words. They called for everyone around to gather, elites, servants, men and women, and those of the third sex. They called on virility, they called on fertility, and as they did so, Loza felt someone between her legs, spreading a powerful smelling dung across and into her vagina, only now realizing that the midnight darkness had spilled all around her. She jumped up bewildered, not knowing what to say. The other spoke first. "Are you a Philistine?" She noticed that everywhere around, amid a sea of fully erect penises of all shapes and colors, people were laughing at her incredulously. "Would you prefer something sweeter than the crocodile feces?" She noted that the others began mixing a jelly-like substance of unripe fruits, dates, and honey, explaining in a gentle hush that this would prevent her from receiving sperm. Loza spread her thighs to welcome the jelly, allowing for a delicate touch to fill her with pleasure once again, while sweet fruit was being slipped into her mouth. From the corner of her eyes, she saw a procession of men and cows walking firmly in line, carrying a sarcophagus. It is time now, after these 70 days, to begin the rebirth. They said, slurring their words in a thick of midnight blue sky. Loza could see the procession gaining more and more followers. She was paralyzed with uncertainty and fear, so paralyzed, in fact, that she failed to notice the black ant making its way excitedly into the jelly spread across her sex. After devouring the honey in the frantic way that ants do, it began to nibble at a minuscule piece of skin on the inside of Loza's lips, which sent warning signals in the form of a slight but distinguishable ache. She pressed against the bite, and having lifted the tiny, intoxicated ant onto the tips of her fingers, Loza was immediately aware of a terrible itch coming from her insides. She had sprung to her feet and ran to join the procession in the hope that rapid movement would sidetrack the itch. When she felt herself tossed against nipples, hard and bulging, with a desire to be touched, these nipples were repeatedly aimed towards Loza's mouth, cheeks, and grazed against her arm. She shied away and heard the murmur of mockery aimed at her once again. "Is she a Philistine?" they asked rhetorically. And that's it. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for your patience. I'm Doug Nichols, and my job here is to not talk too much, to moderate the panel of our speakers. I don't doubt that they are able to speak for themselves. I will simply kick off the question and answer, which is open to all of you as well, with a polite provocation. It seems like one of the things that implicitly was highlighted by this group of distinguished thinkers is that there are certain disciplinary assumptions that characterize each of our perspectives. And in some instances, the difference in disciplinary perspective actually became part of the discussion. So I'm wondering if you all would be interested in addressing the issue of disciplinary method or assumption in thinking about your colleagues' presentations.
That's a provocation.
Where to start? Maybe you should start.
I picked the wrong chair, obviously. I think, well, what is disciplinary identity is something I've struggled with from pretty much the moment I got to university, and that keeps going. I've worked in art history departments. I've been a curator in quite traditional Egyptology departments. I'm now in a history department. I'm apparently supposed to know some history. So, I find that actually very productive. But I do find, I was actually trained as an Egyptologist. I have degrees, and I sometimes joke, except it's not a joke, that all I was trained to do was read hieroglyphs. But of course, the training is what isn't spoken. The training is what you get in the process of sort of naturalized. It's what goes unspoken, or it's the little asides. It's the telling of the Sheikh el-Beled story and the creation of these genealogies. So I suppose my work is almost a critique of myself, maybe, in a way. And that informs how I see representations of Egypt, and have found photography a really productive way to ask those kinds of questions.
You know, I am a true outsider in certain sense, because, you know, I'm very pleased and honored that Liz would ask me to do this. And now, because of the publication of my last book, I have been invited more often than not to gatherings of this sort. But my training was not in art history. It was only really working at the Getty for a year as a scholar, and then just my own sort of interest that I have sort of come out. And I think that there is something to be said as being outsider. When I look at, you know, the most influential, I mean, I say this not to compliment myself, but to say, why is it that the three works that are most cited by far, even if you do a Google search or Google citation sort of a thing, are three works that are written by literary critics? It's Susan Sontag's on photography, It's Walter Benjamin's on the short history of photography, and it's Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida. There is something to be said about the kind of a position of being outsider that I think has enabled me to think beyond the terms that is often offered to me in that way. And that's perhaps the reason that I have abandoned doing literary criticism. It really bores me. I don't do any literary criticism anymore. So I think that what I'm trying to get at, it is good to get out of one's own sort of vocabulary, one's own kind of literary assumptions, because whether we want it or not, whether it's Egyptology or whether it's art history or so on, there is a vocabulary, there's a kind of a, what is, Foucault called discursive formations, that doctors, if you see, speak in a certain way, they ask questions in a different way than lawyers, than linguists, and so on. So I think that as sort of, as viewers of art, as critics of art, as historians of art, I think it's important to think about the implications of the vocabulary and that kind of discursive formation that has positioned us, or positions one as the speaker for that.
That's what I'm getting at, what the questions. So what do you think of art historical questions being posed of Greene's photographs, for instance, versus the questions that come from a history of archaeology or Said's Orientalism, which is, to use a literary critic. So is there a way in which you think that the question presupposes an answer, and that we might all benefit from thinking about other disciplinary approaches when we examine our own methods?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that, that one of the approaches I would say is that really, and this is a lot sort of talked about but not actually practiced, is a certain kind of interdisciplinarity that is required. To be honest, I am incredibly indebted to art historians for educating me about things that I had no idea. It was very telling for me to actually learn and be able, if I were put several pictures, to say, okay, this is this is a salt print, this is a albumin, and these are the kind of thing that one is needed. So I'm not trying to suggest at all, by any means, that we have to throw everything away and just sort of restart everything. I'm just trying to say, what are the ways that we can get into dialogue? Because often I have noticed that in art historical circles, at least from my perspective as an outsider, it has always worked out as a kind of a sort of this, what I would call an ideology of art appreciation. My experience at the Getty was that often, whenever we kind of raised any sort of a question that was critical of art, it was immediately, in some ways dismissed as that's not relevant. And the same way, and this is how I start my talk, is that let's not just simply, jump on a fashion of Orientalism and then abandon it, but to see what are the implications of what we have sort of worked that out. So that's what I was trying to suggest. So I very much rely on art historians. As you saw in my talk, for example, I cite them often and engage with their work in which I hope in a way that it suggests dialogue rather than mere criticism as such. And I think that has to also be done on the part of art historians as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this conference or symposium is an example of that, like bringing people of different disciplines to talk about this, who are going to bring very different angles, and even having me in this to sort of get to rip apart certain things and question and talk about how to engage in that. I mean, I feel like there's as an artist, working in the region, it feels like a responsibility to address this history and the colonial history, and to not just do it to an audience that is sort of already on my side or speaking the same language or engaging with the same sort of terms. And I feel like, this is one form, especially to do it in the institution that is exhibiting this work, for example.
So I have a bunch of things to say. The first is politely. Ali, I was with you in 2009 at the Getty. And I would object, I think, rather strenuously to the idea that anytime art is brought up amongst a group of art historians, that they are not almost the first to be brought on board in the most vehement criticism, both of their discipline, of their objects, and often of themselves. So, I mean, before we flatten, as we try to think about what other disciplines can give our work, I think it's also important not to flatten discourse to, and now I'm about to do it, but to represent, I know what you're referring to, there was one component of thinking, and it came a lot from individuals at the museum, I will say, not to, no, like spit at my host or something like that. Different museum. It's high on a hill. It's not over train tracks, but but I think that element of a kind of self-criticism and what you just said about it's our training that is the kind of unspoken disciplining. So I have spent in my life as an art historian, and I can no longer be an art historian in the way that I was trained. And I've spent the last 15 years working against that, including taking 2 years of MENA studies and anthropology at the University of Chicago as a graduate student, as a professor. So I take that quite seriously. To use not our discipline to challenge the other disciplines, but in fact to use other disciplines to disrupt what we do. So anthropology, for instance, I think has been a very useful discipline that has come in, let art historians in particular think about not just their assumptions of kind of, who speaks and who doesn't speak, or who's underrepresented, or the kind of, your mother's anthropology, but certainly kinds of systems of power and ways of divorcing objects from the context in which we have known them to circulate. And I would say for me, and this may or may not have been apparent in this talk for various reasons of compression, et cetera, but one of the things I think about a lot as someone who writes about both art in the 1960s, 70s, but increasingly in the contemporary moment, is how I write with and about practicing artists and trying to make sure that you're not just parroting or being a spokesperson, a PR rep for artists, but really you are learning from and with either formally the methods that artists might use, which is sometimes allowing yourself more creative freedom, or speaking in dialogue around certain formal principles. So for me, the letter has been one. It's not here, but it's something that's very important in Zachari's work. Thinking about myself doing something that moves forward and that moves backwards in the same talk or presentation, to help me dismantle the certain assumptions built into me as someone who was trained in the mid-90s, both as a kind of historian with a certain teleological investment in how histories get told, and also as a kind of rabid post-structuralist. But so I think the lessons that I learned, for instance, from Basma's work are as important to me as the lessons that I might, learn from an important art historian, as way of thinking about method. But the second thing I wanted to say, because it's not just, I didn't want to just talk about myself, but that it seems as though photography in particular is one of those areas that invites this sort of interdisciplinary interrogation because of its origins, in fact, and original historical implications in so many different discourses and so many various consequences of those discourses, including the telling of history, the categorization of people, the justification of colonial regimes and imperial regimes, the ordering of the sciences, et cetera. So that in and of within itself, it requires us to think that way. And I think we heard it both in the talks today and in the conversations this morning, as we're all looking for different things. But if we can use what we're looking for, what we hear other people are looking for, to challenge our own assumption that even our questions are the right questions, or to understand where those assumptions themselves have come from, oftentimes from the logic of the photographic representation themselves, then we've done good service to our object.
I agree with that. I seriously, what I was going to say is very much along the lines of the uncomfortable place that photography has always had within art history, which I think has actually been very productive. And it's meant that most of us who study photography within the basic framework of art history are always roaming about, looking for other disciplines to get better traction on our subject matter.
Maybe the problem can be recast in a different way, which has to do with the role, independent of disciplines, the role of critique versus sympathy for the subject. I mean, one could adopt a political position, and in some ways, I'm saying this again to be provocative, in some ways, it can answer the question before the question is even posed. We already know the right answer. People should be respectful of one another, and when they're not, you call them out. So there's a kind of moralizing impulse to a certain kind of critique. Conversely, one could approach the subject or the work with some sense of sympathy for an intellectual problem of, let's say, what it would have liked to be J.B. Greene in Egypt at the time, instead of here's what's wrong with J.B. Greene at the time. And I wonder if there's some more nuanced understanding of a figure like Greene that could be arrived at by a combination of the things. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
I think maybe the question is posed to me and maybe to you. I mean, would you like to answer that? Well, I'll take a shot. I mean, first, one thing I did not by any means suggest that, flatten things in art history. I think that far from it. I think that there are great work that are being done and by art historians, and I very much admire and read and so on. I think I was expressing a certain sentiment that I encountered, and I occasionally encounter when I sort of think. I think that those things are not necessarily sort of two different things per se for me. That I love Greene's work, that's something that draws me in. Mm. And by no means what I kind of present is meant to dismiss it as, well, this is all colonialist, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. What I was trying to suggest is that to move beyond the category of the artist, and that kind of as the sort of, this is the sort of the mythologized Greene, and this is, his body of work belongs to this kind of a tradition, by suggesting that, in fact, his work has to be understood in the context of his production in relation to other people. So that, for example, why not to look at Félix and Thénard's work? To me, I looked at some of his images, and I find them equally artistic and interesting, and yet, in some ways, very similar in terms of the mode of representation. So when I kind of present, it sounds sometimes maybe that it's sort of purely political, but it's not. It's more in terms of seeing the kind of a dialogical and dialectical relationship, not only between the various photographers during this time, mm-hmm. but also, as this sort of panel has done throughout the day or afternoon, in terms of the sort of dialogue among the disciplines, so that in order to understand this kind of a piece of this art of photography, you need to understand Egyptology. And if you understand that, you also need to kind of even go back earlier to other modes of representation that sort of define in terms of the way these scenes were depicted prior to photography and so on. So that's what I was suggesting.
And I don't think it's one or the other. I don't think of my research as whether I feel sympathetic about the image or the person who's making it. I simply can't see how you would extricate it from the political circumstances of the knowledge production. And I think the time has come and is past due for people for that to be made present, brought into the light. As I said, people need to feel uncomfortable, and it is so critical to our world today. So my work has become more politicized because of what has been happening. I couldn't write the same way anymore after Tahrir. Why would I? Something needs to change. I don't want to be part of a system through my scholarship that continues to support and say, oh, it's okay. Oh, well, gosh, everybody felt that way at the time. They were just doing what there was to do. And Basma's work, showed that. So, why should we keep repeating history through these archives, through white men, through T.E. Lawrence and the mythology, which I live, at Oxford. Yeah. So I can't see another way to do it, and I think a moment has come where people need to squirm, because only by squirming do you create a potential to do something else, do something differently, do something better.
Yeah, I would say I completely agree, and had similar moments of rupture in my own writing, thinking about history making, what it meant to be a historian involved in this project of history, which I understood to be a project at some point that I can't buy into anymore because of the origins of the whole discipline about being, creating a narrative that renders the world knowable through a set of terms that have already been decided or prefigured by the powers that have decided what is knowable and what is not. And that was, at the juncture of certain political events, I'm trying to configure myself at the juncture of constantly shifting political events in this country and, abroad. And as we, what's the expression? Let the person who's never cast a sin cast a stone. I don't know. Just like you're gonna love and critique. Any object in this museum is going to have been produced in some corrupt, political, imperial, horrible moment, and also show beauty or interesting ideas, or maybe a means of critique, or can be read against the grain, or et cetera. I can love my artists, and I can want to be critical of them, but as we try to make people squirm and realize the situations in which we all sit, I do think it's important that squirming is something that we have to impose upon ourselves as well. So to sit in discomfort with our own assumptions, our own, incapacities, and to open yourself up to the kind of gaze even that is what you want to, at least in the conversation today, and in relationship to the photographs or some that I've seen in some of Matt's exhibition, to invite that discomfort upon yourself such that you can actually do something with the criticism. And I think you were mentioning before even what photographs do, not just what they show, but critique also has to lead to something else to do. Otherwise, it's true, we all know, world's like, it has problems, and we all agree they're all bad in different ways, I'm sure, but yeah. So what does critique let you do?
And this may be, something that is particularly unique to the Middle East. I think that you don't, in the U.S., for example, we have at least, whatever museum sort of exhibition there is of, let's say, representation of African Americans, there is a very clear discussion, or at least some kind of a thing we have accepted to talk about the kind of the slavery, or mention, something to that effect. That's not what you get. When you go to Louvre and you see all those great pieces that came from the Achaemenids and Sassanid antiquity in the Louvre Museum that were brought in by Marcel and Jean de la Foix, is that how you say the name? There is no discussion, not even an acknowledgement, not even a point putting in some kind of a corner of that huge collection saying that they actually violated their contract and did not leave anything to the Nasr ad-Din Shah and the Qajar kings, that they had given them the license to do the digs in these kind of places, to the point that the Nasr ad-Din Shah actually had to cancel their sort of a thing. That kind of a looting is never acknowledged in the context of the Middle East. That's one problem. The other problem is that there is a certain kind of a stereotype of the Middle East as a place of crisis, as a place of sectarian violence. We never, for example, and it only takes a new book by Osama Makdisi called The Age of Coexistence that just was recently published, to say that between 1860 to 1948, there was this kind of ecumenical kind of a tradition that actually many of these people lived together, many of these kind of ethnic, religious, and so on lived together. And there's no understanding of that whatsoever. Even for me, as a Middle Easterner, I was not quite familiar with this kind of this sort of the history. And how much his book shows, for example, what we think of sectarian things are the kind of things that the British did, to the region in the 19th century as well as in 20th century, that kind of, in fact, reinforced and perpetuated these kind of a sectarian kind of a violence and so on. So I think that this is a particular area in the world that is pathologized. Middle East, nowhere else, Middle East in the world that I see is this kind of pathologization of a region, of an entire region, of entire people of various sort. I mean, trust me, as you pointed out, we are plenty to be blamed at, and these kind of dictators and autocrats who were many years supported by the kind of Western forces continue to do this. But I think that's why I think as museum curators, as historical artists, there is a particular burden to contextualize that.
That's a good point. Do we have some questions from the audience? Yes.
I think you're limiting your time span much too significantly. I think if one looks even 10 years ago, before the return of Gaza to whatever forces took it over, you would look at a cross-border, cross-cultural cooperation that was distinctly productive, that created industry that supplied Europe with most of its fresh vegetables, and that until the pullback, the unilateral pullback, you had a cooperative society. And the same thing existed in the area just north of Tel Aviv, between Tel Aviv and Haifa on the border, where Israelis would go to Arab towns on the other side of the border and have coffee on a Saturday or go shopping because the stores in Israel were closed. And this would be the same kind of interaction. I think even today, if you go in areas, for example, near Haifa, which has a multicultural group of people, Arabs, Jews, Druze, you will see cooperation both in commerce and in sports and in the areas of cultural development that are necessary for a healthy society. By limiting your conversation to saying cooperation ended in 48, it's very, very detrimental to the prospects of a growing and positive society. Mm-hmm. And the Middle East, there's many Mutar.
Well, we can discuss this maybe afterwards, because I only brought that up in tangentially as a way of talking about the art. But if you have a question about art,
There is a man named Mutar Kent, who you may know was the head of Coca-Cola International. And 7 or 8 years ago, he said that the Middle East, in what he then called 15 years forward, which is like 7 or 8 years from now, would be like a table. And a table needs 4 legs. And he described one leg as commerce and one leg as markets. And there he said the whole Middle East. And one leg as finance, and he called that the monies from Saudi Arabia. And the 4th leg, he said, was technology. And there he said would be Israel's forte. And through this kind of cooperation, you would have a region that would develop its positive growth in ways that you're implying 48 limited. And I think that art has a responsibility photography, because it is reality, has a responsibility not only to look at what is negative, not to show a child sitting in rubble, but to show the children who are being treated in the hospital or who are playing on the playground, and to look at the positive aspects of growth in ways that only photography can do, because it's immediate, because it's real. And yes, you can set up a picture, and we all know that implications can be made even through supposed reality. But if you're honest as a photographer, and if you're aware of all of the cultural aspects, you have a responsibility. One who is behind that camera has a responsibility to create a product that allows everyone.
Yeah. I think we should let other people
Yeah,
ask
why
questions.
actually, I think what Robin was arguing isn't actually in accord with what you're suggesting about photography being reality. He seemed to be proposing that Greene's pictures were another kind of projection of, I forget what you call the archaeological desire. I'm curious to know what archaeological desire is.
Well, I think the desire I was getting at has to do with a certain withholding that I think the images do. A withholding, and actually I'm going to take a term I received from Matt, but subsidence in the images, and I think that that form of romanticism is something that operates in the Orientalist context, and I, it's a kind of anti-modernity that is also a part of the engine of modernity in certain ways. But I also think it's there in the Forest of Fontainebleau. I mean, I think that's one of the connections that I wish we knew more about with Greene, between that early work with Legray in the Forest of Fontainebleau. Because if you look at the Barbizon painters, they actually, Rousseau, for example, has very much a form of withholding, a kind of sense in which there's something that is in the middle distance or too far back in the painting that's not being given to you, that I find very resonant with Greene's work. And there, again, I mean, the Forest of Fontainebleau was another form of a kind of fantasy of the rural, right? There was all kinds of tourism going on. There was all, it was very much a part of the modernization of France with this kind of backbeat going on. Now, the only issue I have there, though, is whether it's as tight as all that, or whether there's some forms of leakage. In other words, can we just say, well, that's all part of the engine of modernity, that form of longing? And I personally, and I'm questioning all my habits, listening to the wonderful other members of this panel, but my tendency is to want to go to that fine optic. That's probably why I became an art historian. I mean, to go to Ali's notion of like, where do you focus? Is it on the network? Is it on the individual? And I still find the individual a very interesting historical node, and I still find the distinctiveness of certain practices really captivates me, and doubtless that's because of my formation, and maybe I need to reformulate myself. But I do find with Greene, I don't see timelessness. In fact, I see a tremendous sense of temporality, right, in that subsidence. Right? There's almost a kind of enactment of a certain kind of loss and transience, but it's not, I don't look at those things and think, oh, wow, we could go conquer this region, or these monuments could be ours. And, I actually don't get that from Greene. I actually get a very different vibe from those photographs. And I'm trying to figure out what that is. And I don't want to apologize for the photographs, because there's no question that Greene was a part of everything that's being discussed at this table. But at the same time, there is a part of me that I look at the work, and when I'm engaged with the work, I don't think it's quite so simple. I think I still find myself captivated. And that's how I got in this business. And And I can totally see how the politics of which captivations are we going to talk about? Which captivations are we going to feature in the museum? I totally get that, right? I mean, I'm captivated by a whole range of artists with very different subject positions, very different politics. And whether the time is like, now is not the time, you got it done. You got it done, Corey. We done great. I don't know. I don't know. Like, maybe because I'm taking it from this, that maybe we move on to other captivations. But I will still go to my grave saying, wow, those photographs, pretty amazing. Yeah?
I would actually pose that question, because one of the things that interested me in working on the show is that I was met very late in the game, unfortunately, by very strong resistance within my own institution to showing this work. And it was suggested to me 3 months out that we should cancel the show, that we should not be showing this work within the context of our museum. And from a very practical level, it was very late for this conversation to be happening. But from a theoretical, I was like, I would have been really interested to have this conversation about a year and a half ago. But I'm interested to hear from you, because I can hear the arguments for not showing this work, and I would be interested to hear from you. How would you respond to that criticism? And I don't take this personally in any way. You shouldn't be showing this work. I'm interested to hear that. I just would love to know how you would respond to a critique that says we should not be perpetuating this sort of kind of work by showing it within the museum.
I've never been a supporter of PC police. So I think that one of the things that one has to really say that on what ground then are we, we are sort of in a way silencing a certain historical kind of phenomena. I mean, are we now not supposed to talk about slavery or genocide of Native Americans because those are painful kind of comments and so on? And plus, I completely agree with you that there is, it's not the point was not to say there was kind of Greene was trying to say, hey, we need to conquer that kind of image. I think that one issue that I wanted to sort of bring up is that the kind of a context in which these images were produced and received as a kind of a broad sort of a term, rather than blaming the artist. I mean, in literary studies, long time ago, we went beyond authorial intentionality. So what Flaubert thought when he was writing Madame Bovary was beside the point. Or getting to the point of like saying, this is what Flaubert meant by writing Madame Bovary. The part of the reason that makes the text plural, as Barthes would tell us, and what makes Greene's photography so potent and plural is precisely the kind of new conditions and new times for reinterpretation, re-engagement with some of those kind of
I suspect that we're probably in agreement about that. And, Corey, there's an old saying that says, when you're in Hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right.
That kind of approach to, even if you're sympathetic to the politics, that kind of approach is not productive. And I don't think, if you miss the opportunity to have the conversation, even to have the debate about the methodological approach, you've not done anyone a service, actually, either politically or for the sake of your own academic discipline or something. So I think that the best thing that we could do is what we're doing right now, have the show and have the conversation, and those that are too narrow-minded to entertain a question that challenges them are probably not worth our efforts.
But I also, can I just add quickly that I feel like, there is a way to deal with it by addressing it. I think you're sort of saying that, but we can address it in the way that these things are exhibited. Like, nobody's saying that you can't like the photographs. They're very beautiful, but like, they're too problematic not to have that addressed in the context of the exhibition. And I think even more so at SF MoMA than here, because it's a contemporary institution, and that, we can't just say, poof, these photographs appeared out of nowhere. I mean, there's a reason why these photographs exist, and it's political. And the more that we continue to suppress that politics, and even your question, I mean, I've been like stewing over your question about like, can we sympathize with him? Why do we have to sympathize with him? I mean, I think it's important for us to be rigorous and in our response to these images, and that's doing service to those images. That's
But
like.
is it possible to even imagine any 19th century cultural object that didn't come out of a context where people were treated unjustly?
No, but maybe
No,
it's time
in
to
which
address
case there'd be
that.
nothing to show. We would never talk
system of
about it.
thought?
Sorry.
I think we're having actually such a great discussion, and I want to continue it over a glass of wine, which is waiting for us in the other room. I want to thank all of our panelists and our moderators.